This video is part of a series on experiences of the Enneagram from the 27 subtypes. I'm aiming to interview people of each subtype, so you get to hear and experience what those different voices and life experiences sound like. I hope you enjoy. Hey Samantha, thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Can you share a little bit about your Enneagram type and subtype?
Oh, thanks, Matt. It's lovely to be here chatting with you today. I am a self-preservation 7 with a social repressed instinct.
Thank you. When did you first hear about the Enneagram?
Oh, that was really interesting. So I was doing a project for our air traffic control company, and I was there to do a change project. And this is 2015, 2016, so a while ago now. And I was in that planning stage and trying to figure out how to approach it. And the boss came in and said, here's this report on the Enneagram and our organization. Everyone's sixes, so it'd be really useful to know. And I'm like, what's a six? What's the Enneagram? I don't know what any of this means. And he'd handed me a copy of Helen Palmer's Enneagram book. And I was I was reading through it, and I was like, I cannot learn this system in time to understand what to do with this information, which is really unfortunate, because if I understood what sixes meant at the time, would have been a game changer. But I didn't.
Oh.
And so I set it aside. So that was really my first exposure to the Enneagram, because I'd never heard of it. And yes, I can see how they were an organization of sixes, and it would have really benefited me to understand that.
Okay, so you first heard about it in the workplace. How long ago? How long ago was this?
2016, maybe, give or take.
2016. Okay. So what was your experience in discovering your type?
So once, that day they'd talked about sixes, I better go take a test, see what I am. And I came out as a 5. And I thought,
Okay.
well, this is interesting, but I can see it, but I can't see it. And I think because it never landed for me in that moment, I also set it aside. And so it was a few years later, once I was already studying the Myers-Briggs system, that I heard about the Enneagram again. And I met a colleague or practitioner who was IEQ 9 certified. And so she gave me the opportunity to take a test. The day before I was got to get the test and do the debrief, I finally picked up a copy of Beatrice Chestnut's 9 Types of Leadership. Now, I'd had this book for a while, but like any good 7, I had not read it yet. It was in the stack. It was in the pile.
Cool.
And so I went through the book trying to figure out what type I was, because, here's what gives it away. I was like, well, whatever the test says, I'm not going to believe it unless I've already decided for myself what I am. I had to know, because otherwise I just would dismiss the test. And so I read through the book. I was like, none of these types are me. And when I say I read through the book, I read the first few sentences of each chapter and then dismissed it and kept moving, because we 7s like to skim read and skip over and don't get too much into detail. So I was like, okay, let's do this again. Let's read the first 3 paragraphs, let's go slightly deeper than the first one. And so after that, I got to the part of the 7 that talked about not just that hedonism, which I didn't really resonate with, but I think what they were described almost more of a sexual 7 description is that idealistic, getting lost in ideas, brainstorming, and just, all of those sort of fascination, suggestibility pieces. And I was like, this is it. I'm a 7. This is great. And the next day I got the test result. The test result was for a sexual 7. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. I can read this report. And I found parts of it useful.
Okay.
The sexual 7 bit obviously didn't land, but because I was really immersed in just understanding the 7 piece, it wasn't as crucial that wasn't spot on at that point in time.
Okay. Thank you, Samantha. So what I heard you share there is you're introduced into the Enneagram in the workplace, and it sounds like they labeled everybody sixes because it was a 6 environment. And then you took a test and you came out as a 5 the first time round. And then you did another test, but before you did another test, you wanted to kind of read the 9 types of leadership styles from Beatrice Chestnut to see, I want to identify my own type first. And you landed with 7. And then when the test came out as a sexual 7, you felt more kind of more confident, I guess, with the test result being 7, as you'd already identified that for yourself.
Mm.
So the
And these were
first,
several years apart. Like this wasn't,
okay,
these are 3 years apart, these
okay,
particular incidences. Yeah.
okay. Thanks for that clarification. So, how long did you live with the idea that you might be a five, or did you not live like that you were a five?
I just didn't take it on. Now, I was
Okay,
living at point 0.5, so there was sort of that decade of my life was very much at point 0.5, so the test results
interesting.
wasn't necessarily incorrect. It
Okay,
just
yeah,
wasn't my
that's
true
interesting.
motivation. Yeah.
Okay, what was the first test that you did?
Oh, one of the free ones.
Okay, one of the free
Maybe the
ones.
Reti, but it was definitely not a paid
Sure.
report.
Okay, so it was like you say, it was accurate in identifying where you were at, maybe at from with an arrow point.
Mm,
Yeah, but
yeah.
really helpful that you were able to go and say, no, I need to identify this for myself because identifying our type via a test alone is a helpful starting place, perhaps. But to say, oh, I came out as a five, therefore I'm a five, full stop, that can lead to a lot of mistyping, I imagine. To just
And
rely
it
on the
just
test.
didn't, yeah, it just didn't sit right, And I
Mm,
don't think I think if I'd typed as a 7 that first time around and the report had resonated with me, I might have started working with the Enneagram a lot sooner. But
okay.
because it
Yeah.
didn't, and my work life was too busy to really consider it, it took a few more years before it sort of swung back into my life.
Okay. And just skipping forward a bit, you said about 3 years apart when you took the second test and you was reading Beatrice's book, The Leadership Styles. When you got to the seven bit and you were kind of skim reading the types, did you immediately think, I'm a seven?
No, I had to go through the book multiple times before I could finally land on the type.
Okay. Were there other types that you were considering when you were going through the book?
It's been a few years ago, so it's hard to
Okay.
remember. But it was probably, I think some were easier to dismiss than others. I definitely
Okay.
have strong arrow points with the 5 and the 1. And then I could see parts of the 9 because parts of me are very conflict avoidant, as a 7 is.
Okay.
And I probably dismissed the 2s pretty quickly. I've definitely debated 4 for a long time because a huge part of my career motivation has been around doing something special, meaningful.
Mm,
And I've since learnt that really comes more from my social repressed and expression there. So I think I've spent longer considering 4 later on, but at that point, it was more, easy to dismiss certain things and just took a bit more time and patience to really appreciate I was the 7. I think a lot of it is the languaging. When they describe
okay.
7s as being very hedonistic, it just
Mm,
wasn't something I resonated with. It's only really on a lot of reflection that I can see how there are elements of hedonism in my 20s, but
okay.
it's not, I never really saw myself as that stereotypical party person. And that put me off a lot of the descriptions of 7. It wasn't until I read something that said you can just be gluttonous about ideas and gluttonous about books and gluttonous about food and theater and all the things I was interested in that I could understand or see what alternate forms of gluttony might be, as opposed to partying and drinking and going to raves. And I wish I'd been to more raves, but and festivals, but my social press just doesn't allow that. I get far too anxious in those sort of really large festival type events. So that's why I was
Mm.
like, well, I didn't party it up. I'm not a hedonist because I couldn't bring myself to really enjoy those large scale festivals.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. That's really helpful. And as more information became available to you, it helped you to identify your type and subtype a bit more.
Yeah, so it was a couple of years before I confirmed my actual subtype. I was at a workshop with Bean Aranio and a group of 7s, and they suggested I might be
Mm.
self-pres as opposed to sexual. And
Okay,
then working with my mentor through the program, I went and did some analysis, and I took the complete Enneagram and analyzed the sections on each of the subtypes, underlining any sentence that sounded like me from all 3 sections. And then I essentially just added them up, just did some simple maths, which section has the most underlines and which has the least. And that gave me my sequence. And I didn't necessarily want to be a self-pres. It was very uncomfortable to go,
Okay.
oh, you're not the fun one.
Okay.
Um, and I can see how there are actually some six-ish type elements to the self-pres, and I saw some of those coming out at the time. But yeah, that's sort of
Interesting.
how I did it. Yeah.
Yeah. And interesting how that we're coming back to that six piece and how your first experience of the Enneagram, where if I heard you correctly, people in your workplace were labeling people sixes. Were you labeled as a six as well at that point?
No, they'd had an Enneagram expert come in and type the organization. I don't know how that happened before I had arrived.
Okay, I
But you can
see.
imagine that with air traffic controllers, you want them to be sixes. You want them to
Yeah,
be anticipating danger. So it makes
of
a lot of
course.
sense.
Yeah, and interesting how you got the self-pres dominant and your, six wing. There's a wing there, isn't there? So maybe
Mm,
that was kind of coming through, at that point a bit stronger than other times in your life, perhaps.
I don't know. I don't know. I was at such a five place. Yeah, not sure.
Okay. How has knowing your subtype been helpful to you?
Really helpful, because I think some of the things that I just thought were sensible and, a great way to lead your life might actually be defensive. And so when I had a lot of chronic illnesses, and one of the things I did as part of my recovery is find a lot of people to help me be free of pain. And so I would call them my support crew. And so I would have a chiropractor, an acupuncturist, a naturopath, a massage therapist. There was a list.
Mm,
And so, when pain would flare up, I would write, who do I call? And when it didn't work, eventually I'd get down to the acupuncturist and I go, right, I should have called you first, fix me. And before I discovered the Enneagram, I realized that there was a point in which this wasn't necessarily a great approach. It wasn't a long-term approach, and I needed to learn to sit with the pain. And I actually discovered that before I discovered the seven piece. And so when I looked at
okay.
the seven report and looked back, I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. But it's taken more to see how creating that sort of group and that trusted alliance, or that sort of that family network, or the mafia, as we call them, how I was using that to avoid pain. And so there was that example. But even just later on, when I worked in organizations, I'd be great at networking, getting to know everyone across the organization, because it would help me achieve my goals or aims or whatever they were. But I was never close to those people. It was always just, how can I use these people to help me get what we need to do for the organization? It felt altruistic. It didn't feel manipulative. And then an example I had maybe a year or two ago is I realized that I almost see each person in my friend group as an expert on something. And so if
Okay.
I come across a decision that I don't know how to make, where I don't feel like an expert, if I don't feel like I have the knowledge, I then essentially enlist that person to make the decision for me. And what I've realized, and I think this applies to the self-pres 7 piece overall, is that we don't always get what we want. We start off by thinking, this is what I need. What's the best way to get that? And then we get to it and go, oh, well, I got what I needed, but I didn't get what I wanted. And so, or I got what I wanted and I didn't get what I needed. And I needed help to make the decision around buying some makeup. And a friend of mine's very, makeup person. And, I followed her steps and I went through it all. And I got to the end and went, well, this is not what I wanted. I've now spent hundreds of dollars and this is not what I wanted. And without the Enneagram, I wouldn't have realized what had just happened in that process, because I had that tool there. I could immediately reflect on what had just happened, because I was like, oh, what happened? I didn't get what I wanted. I was like, oh, you outsourced your trust and expertise to
Mm,
someone else. So even though you're self-referencing, even though this is about what you want, because you don't trust your knowledge or your instincts or your intuition, you've still outsourced that to someone else. And I found it interesting to be able to see that in action, because otherwise I never would have really understood that inner dynamic of that play that was happening for me.
mm. That's really interesting. And just hearing you share some of that, I can resonate with some of what you're sharing, coming from the six space. And I also wonder how much of the six is in your experience with that, as a seven.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in that lens. When I see myself through the 6 lens, it's more of the catastrophizing piece and really
Okay.
running scenarios about what could go wrong. And when I've seen that the most, so when I was growing up, I would do a lot of hiking. And before we'd go on these 5-day hikes, I would run all these scenarios and think about, okay, what happens if someone breaks a leg? What happens if someone gets bitten by a snake? I live in Australia, so, you need to actually run these
Yeah,
scenarios.
definitely.
And my pack would be so heavy because I'd have all this extra food and all this first aid supplies and all the maps.
Okay.
And so to
Yeah.
me, that looked far more 6-ish than some of these other pieces that's more driven to get my needs met.
Mm. And I wonder, among other things, if it's a combination of the 6 and the self-pres, like just a combination of things going on there with the self-pres instinct dominant and the 6.
Not sure, because I think that the 7 and the self-pres combined can be very, very focused on getting the needs met through however they can, the creativity. How can I creatively get these needs met? What's the fun way
Sure. Okay.
to get this happening? And so I see it almost as a very playful, what are all the different ways I could get this thing? And let's go out and let's have fun while we go out and get it. And it just, I don't think when I'm in that self-pres 7 piece, it feels as 6-ish. It has to be something that's extra stressful, or out of the ordinary, or extra pressurized, that takes me more into that 6 side of things and getting more actively fearful. The more growth work I've done, the more in touch I am with that anxiety. But when I was younger, I really wasn't in touch with that anxiety at all.
And where would you say that anxiety comes from in an Enneagram perspective?
Oh, simply from that fear of suffering that the 7s
Yeah.
experience, and the core, that core piece of fear that we struggle with. And so if we go, deeper down the rabbit hole, it's that, fear of not having my needs met, the fear of not being taken care of, and the fear of being attacked, all the usual self-pres fears, combined with that sense of, I'm not going to get taken care of or looked after in some way.
Mm. And I wonder also how much of the triad of fear that the head types are in, how much there's like a double dose of fear there as well for us self-pres head types. We've got the fear of that, and then we've got the fear of being in the head triad as well. It's like a double dose of it.
So much. I've definitely struggled with anxiety over the years, but it's the way I experience my anxiety now is very different. And I'm very pleased that the Enneagram's shown me the difference. And, I lived in this apartment a little while, and I lived there for 9 years, and it was on the 8th floor. There was a locked door. You had to get up a lift. There was, the locked doors at the front, and I would still have anxiety about someone breaking in, and we'd never been broken into. There was never ever a hint of ever being broken into. And I would still lock my bedroom door at night if the house was empty, because I had this anxiety about someone coming in. And I think knowing the Enneagram and understanding, being able to label that anxiety and go, and use the tool of the 6s. Is this fear real, or is it imagined? Is there any evidence for this? I found that helpful to help me move through or work through some of that anxiety, to bring on the tool of the 6 for that.
Lovely. Thanks for sharing that, Samantha. This is more of a kind of a general question, but what has been your experience with the Enneagram since you've been on a journey with it?
Goodness. I think the Enneagram's sort of been revolutionary. So I've been into personality systems for a while. I think they're very helpful in understanding ourselves, understanding others, being able to really step into our full self. I think for various reasons, a lot of us don't feel actually able to embody who we really are. And I think personality systems generally help us be able to differentiate ourselves from others and differentiate others from ourselves. And so do it in both directions. And, we don't always value our strengths. And I think it's really important when we're using personality type in the early days is to just help be ourselves, and what we would call, restructuring the ego. So if you haven't been allowed to be a 7 when you're a kid, You need
Mm.
time as an adult to actually come into your sevenness. And I had a manager, and this is before I discovered the Enneagram, but turned out she was a 7. And I needed that freedom from that boss to almost figure out who I was in the workplace. Because before then, I was sort of following all these pseudo rules. And those rules weren't necessarily imposed. Sometimes they were just unspoken. And it wasn't that I didn't have good managers. It's just that I needed someone who said to me, you do whatever you want. Show up at work, whatever time you want to show up, whatever works for you. And that freedom helped me go, what do I want to do? I actually worked so much harder for that manager than I'd ever worked for anyone before, because I didn't need to rebel. There was no need for rebellion of any kind. I just got to do whatever I wanted, and it was great. I think the Enneagram has then taken it to a next level, because I think it's shown us how personality is a defense system, how it holds us back from getting what we really want, and how trying to just build on our strengths actually isn't going to help us become more mature adults. It actually undermines that process. And really, the Enneagram shows us how we can create more space and expand more into ourselves and mature by moving out of our contractions and finding a way to be more present and less defended. And I haven't found any other system that does that as well as the Enneagram.
Lovely. Thanks for sharing that, Samantha. Are there any sort of specific areas where you found the Enneagram most helpful to you in your life?
I would say, I think relationships, just
Okay.
understanding people and their differences. What's the dynamic with a 9? What's the dynamic with a 2 or a 4 or an 8? And using that to help understand, what is the personality masking? Because we all have wounding, and our personality exists to protect us from that wounding. And as adults in relationships, we're there to help each other heal. And we often don't know how to do that. And so we create more conflict or more wounding, and we compound what's already there. And so I think the Enneagram gives us compassion and understanding without having to go through all the details. You can know that an 8 has this incredibly soft, tender center, and they don't need to explain that to you. You can just start your conversation, much more simply. And I think it helps create a shortcut for your interactions with other people. I mean, I think it also helps you get to know yourself really well, but I found it most useful for a lot in relationships.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I resonate a lot with that. Is there anything you'd like to share about your experience with the Enneagram?
Do you mean professional or personal?
Either or both.
I think one thing that's really interesting about 7s that isn't really discussed a lot is how happiness or excitement is defensive. We often think about as sadness or anger or fear as sort of being bad emotions, and happiness as being this great positive. Everyone must be happy. And for 7s, it's actually not very helpful. And we're not the only type that uses happiness defensively, but we do it pretty well. And for me, excitement feels amazing. I love feeling excited. I'd love to chase that feeling all day. And what I need to recognize is when I'm excited about something, that's actually me being defensive. That's me being in personality. And I actually have to be skeptical of the excitement and go, what's that masking? What's the fear behind that? What's the opportunity you're chasing? What is the suffering you're trying to avoid? And so it's understanding, for me as a 7, what the role of excitement is. Obviously I've had to grapple with sadness and become much more comfortable with grieving. And that's been a huge practice for me, but also equally seeing the role of happiness and how that isn't necessarily a neutral emotion for 7s.
And with the happiness piece, would you say that predominantly comes from being a type 7 rather than a subtype?
I think each 7 would use excitement differently. For a self-pres 7, excitement is usually about chasing an opportunity to get a good deal or to make something happen. And I had an opportunity to really examine that firsthand a year or two ago. And what I could see in the moment was how I was trying to cover something up. So I was like, I'm going to go pitch these people this idea. I'm going to get paid for this, and that's going to compensate me for this thing I don't want to do. And at the time, the excitement feels so good that it's hard to connect that actually it's something you don't want to do. And I had to really pause and stop and go, okay, well, if you don't want to do it, why don't you just not do it? Is the opportunity you're chasing something you truly want, or is it just compensation for yourself, for your pain, the pain you're going to have to go through for this thing you don't want to do? And so it really gave me pause and ability to have a whole new conversation with myself.
Yeah, brilliant. And with the type 7 and with the self-preservation 7, what kind of pain do they avoid? Is it the physical, emotional, or any kind of pain or suffering, or is it a certain type of pain or suffering?
I feel like we're skilled at avoiding all pain.
Yeah.
I think the one I've avoided most is emotional pain. The physical pain was harder to avoid, but still quite skilled at that. And then I think also, use the 4 domains, mental pain and spiritual pain.
Yeah.
It was much harder to connect or understand what those pains are like because they're not necessarily discussed as often. That overthinking, analysis paralysis. We might not understand what that mental pain looks like because we don't really discuss it that way. And then the spiritual disconnection was something I just didn't even understand or couldn't comprehend until I really started on the path. And so for me, my drive throughout all of the recovery journey has been to be creative. And that's a very 7 trait. We are very creative people, but I was very disconnected and not able to be creative. And so I think it's really interesting how one of the key traits of 7s is that creativity, and how I wasn't able to do that. And so a lot of this journey has been releasing, the pain that gets in the way of me being creative. And that's really been a very core theme of the whole piece.
Thanks. It's lovely to hear your journey, Samantha, and how you're growing. It's really encouraging.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about being a self-pres 7 that people might find helpful to know?
I may have mentioned this already, but I think the most helpful thing is understanding that gluttony doesn't have to come from being a party animal, or using alcohol or drugs or other things excessively. And I'd say if you are a 7, you are considering yourself a 7, look at where you're gluttonous, look at what you're over consuming, and just see that. For me, I would often read 100 books a year. And I wouldn't necessarily read them in depth. I would skim read them, because I was just trying to get the pleasurable bits as quickly as possible. So some of the development activities I've done over the last few years is rereading books. It wasn't just a new book, rereading books. This year, my aim is to read less books, only reading 2 a month, which, pros and cons. And so it's really, where is the gluttony? And yes, for 7s, that's a little more materialistic. But that doesn't necessarily mean money, and this is the really interesting thing about the language with the Enneagram, is when we use certain words, how we understand them is not necessarily how the writer conveyed them. So what Beatrice meant when she wrote materialistic is not necessarily what I understand when I read materialistic. I think that's the challenge with all of the Enneagram descriptions, is it comes through our lens, and that lens isn't just our personality type, that's our life experience and the culture we live in. And so I was like, well, I wouldn't see myself as materialistic. And yet at times I'm a complete hoarder. There's a whole lot of things that I hold on to. And so it's really, I think, being able to look beyond the words and see a broader definition or explanation of what the complex of each personality type looks like, and what is the trauma it's trying to mask, and the patterns and the way it's doing that. And so I would just say, the subtypes are very helpful, but it can take a time to find what your subtype is, because you almost have to see each of the 27 through the lens of your own habits and behaviors. And so it can be really useful to use examples like, movies or meeting people of each type to help you really understand which type you might be.
Yeah. Thank you, Samantha. And also, I'm just thinking about learning styles as well. For those of us that maybe don't learn as well as, maybe if reading a book, reading words on a page, the information doesn't necessarily compute as it would watching a video or a movie or a visual. So there's that whole kind of information, how we take on information as well. So the information might, what I'm trying to say is the information might be accurate in a book, but because it hasn't been expanded in a visual way of explaining it, or maybe sometimes the language is limited, and there is more to be said. I personally believe that every human being is like unique, but there are obviously so there's like multiple versions of the same subtype and instinctual sequence and everything, which makes it can make it a bit more complicated and there's other factors as well, as you know, that can make it more complicated in landing with our core type. And depending on what our core type is, which has been the case for me, will also determine how tricky it can be to land on core type.
Well, that's
so
it.
it's really interesting.
Sevens are reading too quickly to really take in the depth.
Yeah.
So, we skim read and you can't necessarily get to the depth of the nugget of something until you can slow down. And so that's a challenge for sevens. And I have met someone of my exact type and type sequence of I'm not too dissimilar age. And we were so different, we were so different because we had completely different life experiences. And what I found interesting, though, listening to him talk, was that we'd learnt the same lessons, but we'd learned them for different reasons and through different experiences and different approaches, but it was the same lesson underneath. And that's what I found particularly interesting about meeting someone of my exact, type and sequence.
Interesting. And I think you touched on it earlier as well in a different context, that we might have the same type and sequence as somebody, but a different cultural overlay, different life experiences. So there'd be a similar theme, but each person is unique in that sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know that you work with the Enneagram professionally. Can you share what it is that you do and where people can find more about your work and what you have to offer?
Absolutely. Well, they can find me at individuo.life. I provide coaching and mentoring. And really my focus is on that creative piece. I believe everyone is creative and we all have a creative spark within us that for various reasons, both personality and cultural conditioning and living in a society that is really focused on productivity rather than creativity, that creative spark within us has been smothered or suffocated in some way. And how do we get back to expressing our authentic individuality? And how do we get back to just allowing ourselves to be creative every day? And creativity doesn't mean being an artist or working in a creative field, because when we are creative, we feel alive. And there's nothing more beautiful than that feeling of aliveness without the level of, the excitement layered over the top. And it's I really like helping people who really just want to feel their creative juices flow more, whether it's for themselves or for others, and helping them step into their authentic individuality, using the Enneagram, but also a range of other tools.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I wish you all the best for the future, and it's been very insightful to hear all that you've shared. All the best, Samantha. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for creating the opportunity. It's been great to talk to you.